research assistant at CSPR, which is the Center for Social and Political Research. And we are a newly founded research center based in Karachi, Pakistan, which has been founded with the collaboration of teachers and students across Pakistan. And we basically produce a series of articles, webinars, discussions and interviews on social and political issues in the region. And we also have a program known as Foresight, where we have these program of interviews that we conduct on regional politics. And for the same reason, we've invited you here today. So thank you so much for joining us. And we would particularly like to talk about the Kashmir conflict, which is where you hold your expertise. So I'll jump straight into the questions. The very first thing that I want to ask is that a lot of parallels have been drawn between the Kashmir conflict and the Israel-Palestine conflict. So do you think that there are any parallels to draw? Are there any similarities?
Great, thank you for your question. So first, I would like to thank you so much for this kind invitation. It's such an honor to speak to you and to your students to share my work and my ideas. So first, thank you so much. Second, to think about your question, I think especially people in Kashmir feel, from my conversations, do feel there's a lot of parallels. Also, from those Palestinians that I've spoken to, they also, once they learn about the experience of Kashmiris, the more they learn, the more they realize there are quite a few parallels, specifically about the material reality on the ground. The level of militarization is exceptionally high in both Kashmir, West Bank, Gaza, but even the treatment of Palestinians inside places like Jerusalem, which is quite similar to the treatment of Kashmiris inside Delhi, right? The level of discrimination. So the high level of militarization, which leads to high potential and incidence of human rights abuses, right? The areas where there's a high concentration of Palestinians and Kashmiris, specifically Srinagar and other areas, are treated as these sort of zones of exception where typically laws that would be considered ordinary in democratic states no longer apply. And so, again, this leads to human rights violations. The multi-generational trauma that results from this high level of militarization and human rights violations is something you see in both among Palestinians and among Kashmiris. Recently, there's been a UN report about collective punishment used by the Israeli state against Palestinians. And this is something that the UN has spoken up about when it comes to Kashmir, and India's sort of blockade of information as a form of collective punishment. So the forms of violence might sometimes differ, sometimes be similar, but the overall experience of trauma and level of human rights violation across generations is so similar, where you do see a lot of space for solidarity building. And it's not just Palestinians and Kashmiris. I'm talking to you from the United States, and the experience of Black people in the US is also quite similar in many respects, living in what we call ghettos. Again, these zones of exception where normal rules and laws don't apply, where human lives are not valued as much as they ordinarily do. So there are these patterns you see globally, including in the United States.
Secondly, in your book, you speak of outsourcing war. So is the use of non-state actors in Kashmir justified by either countries under current circumstances?
Oh, this is a really important question, because sometimes states and militaries that use non-state actors to carry out their policies feel they're justified, but under international law, they are not legal. You cannot use non-state actors. You cannot have those who are there to carry out military responsibilities pose as civilians. That is illegal. That puts civilians in civilian life in jeopardy. So it is illegal, it is unethical, because these are people who are not trained in the military's rules of conduct, laws of conduct, and you're just sort of releasing them, and they have their own interests to carry out, whatever it is that they want to do in addition to maybe what you want them to do. So it oftentimes backfires. Sometimes it gives kind of short-term strategic benefits. These individuals have that local knowledge. Sometimes they have the connection to the local population that your military doesn't. So that offers some sort of strategic or tactical really benefits. But in the medium and long term, it's very hard to find incidents of conflicts where these actors helped achieve real peace, sustainable peace. So Kashmir is a perfect example. For decades. The Ikhwan, the renegades that the Indian government and the military have used, have yielded some tactical benefits, but ultimately Kashmir is not a peaceful place where the local population is happy to be under Indian rule. The majority of the local population, that is, of course, these kind of opinions differ when you talk to local Kashmiris, but quite a majority of them, I think, wants to have more say in the fate of the region.
And secondly, how much has Pakistan learned about managing proxies from the Afghan war, and how can those lessons be applied in Kashmir now?
So Pakistan has been in the news for a very long time, criticized by India for using what they call terrorist organizations to carry out sort of its foreign policy in Kashmir clandestinely. So this is something that India promotes, this idea globally. So from the point of view of reputation, global reputation, local reputation, it's a policy that just doesn't yield the results that Pakistan wants. Strategically, it hasn't really worked either. It's not giving Pakistan what it wants. So it's strategically and politically it sort of doesn't work. Diplomatically, Imran Khan brings up the Kashmir issue all the time. The UN Security Council recently, once again, considered whether or not something should be done about India's revocation of Kashmir's special status, and there's been silence. So diplomacy is also quite difficult. At the same time, India's crackdown on Kashmir, starting with August 5th, has drawn a lot of international condemnation. The whole status of India as a democracy is deeply in question in the United States, in the West. You read opinion editorials, news constantly about how, is India, really a democracy? So there is a space, sort of a diplomatic space for Pakistan to step in. Problem is Pakistan's reputation, is also difficult. So it's kind of caught in the situation where, damn if you do, damn if you don't, with diplomacy. And again, the use of proxies in Kashmir is, again, strategically non-viable as well. When you talk to Kashmiris, they do see this as their local conflict, and quick to point out that a lot of the militants are actually local Kashmiris, and they might receive support from Pakistan, but this is their war. And also when you talk to Kashmiris, many of them want, like, whether or not they want independence for Kashmir rather than joining Pakistan. So, again, some of the organizations that Pakistan may support in Kashmir would prefer for Kashmir to join Pakistan rather than for Kashmir to have independence. So there's a clash of interests that ultimately would have to be resolved. So there's a lot of contradictions and problems with that policy.
And speaking of India, after Article 370 has been revoked, it was a bold step by the BJP party, but it did win them a victory in India. So do you think that there is a step towards the desecularization of India?
Well, yes, everyone speaks about that. That is just quite evident. India is moving in a very right-wing direction away from democracy towards authoritarianism more and more. And again, this is just sort of all over the news. This is you talk to experts, you talk to policymakers. There's a recognition that that India is really losing its sort of secular character in its democratic character. The very things that really made it stand out and made it seem like a real sort of a rising power, a great rising power that would be counter to China, an authoritarian state. India, sort of, at least by American strategists, was seen as a way to counter China's hegemony with something that is kind of more liberal, more democratic, alternative. And now there's a lot of disillusionment with India, from at least from the West, as being seen as the country to kind of, as US is declining, as a country to rise and to kind of to help replace US in some spaces.
Okay, and another thing with Article 370 being revoked is that Indians can now possess land in Kashmiri territory, and this will eventually change the demographic of the region. So what would this mean for any future plebiscite?
Yes, so that and the issuing of domicile certificates at a high speed. So these are, of course, intended to change the demographic character of Kashmir. At the same time, the prospect of plebiscite is seen as so remote and just so unlikely. I am very hopeful. I think, again, when you talk to Kashmiris, it is something that they hope will be an option for them. It is an option that the United Nations has promised since 1948. And I really think it's the only legitimate way, ultimately, to bring peace to Kashmir. And so by bringing in individuals from outside the region to sort of to dilute the influence of local Kashmiris who do want the plebiscite and do want independence or some sort of change in policy, if not full independence, it is intentional. In the long term, it would have that effect. I think it would take quite a few years. I think a lot of the domicile certificates are being issued in the Hindu majority areas. It will be difficult for those who are outsiders to really settle in the valley in a way that they will feel comfortable. I think that there's going to be backlash against that. So the fight is likely to continue. The militarization is likely to rise, and it is. There's been recently another law considered where the military could determine something to be a strategic area and then just take over a space and govern that space anywhere in Kashmir, including in the valley. So there's a lot of going to be tension. And maybe that's one way to kind of counter the backlash that's bound to ensue when you bring in outsiders into Kashmir after all these years. So I think it's the intention. I don't think it's going to work, at least in the short term. It might work in a decade or two, which is all the more important to bring up the issue of plebiscite and to really advocate for that. And again, it might be counter to Pakistan's interests, which I think ideally would love to see Kashmir be part of Pakistan, but it's giving a say to Kashmiris, including to those in Azad Kashmir, would sort of kind of help to resolve this issue.
Well, this was my last question. So thank you so much again for joining me and answering all of these. And I hope that CSPR can coordinate with you in the future as well.
So, very much my pleasure.
Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nosheen. Thank you.